Don't want to knock you off the stage.
My goodness, we have a good crowd for this first session this early in the morning. Although those of us who come from the East Coast or Central Time, we're probably up very early this morning.
All right, we're ready for that.
At like 6 a.m.
Well, it's 9:30, so let's get started. My name is Coralie Wilson, the Executive Director of the North Suburban Communications Commission in Roseville, Minnesota, serving 9 cities. This session is called Local Franchising, Swimming Upstream. So we're going to be looking at the future of cable franchising for our local franchising authorities. And we have a very distinguished panel to join us and help us with this discussion. And the goal is to, for each of them to keep their presentations relatively brief, considering they're all attorneys, so that we can have some discussion. The whole idea is to get some feedback and to talk with you folks as well. Our first speaker will be Brian Grogan, who's a shareholder and director with the Minneapolis law firm of Moss & Barnett, practicing in the firm's communications, business law, and infrastructure practice groups. Since 1988, when he was a mere child, Brian worked with entities throughout the country on a variety of cable, telecom, wireless, and broadband communications issues. In his business law practice, Brian focuses on fiber and conduit lease agreements, mergers and acquisitions, and contract matters in the communications and technology industries. He's the past chair of the communications law section of the Minnesota State Bar Association. He'll be followed by Dan Cohen, the principal attorney of the Cohen Law Group. For 19 years, he also started as a child. The Cohen Law Group has specialized exclusively in representing local governments in cable, wireless, and broadband matters. The firm is located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Prior to starting the firm, Mr. Cohen served on the Pittsburgh City Council for 12 years. He was the principal negotiator for the city in cable franchise agreements with Comcast and Verizon. He also led Pittsburgh's effort to regulate cable rates in the early 1990s. He graduated from Yale University and from Stanford Law School. And batting cleanup will be Joe Van Eaton, a partner in Best and Krieger's municipal law practice group in the firm's Washington, D.C. office. Prior to joining the firm in 2011, he was named a partner of Miller & Van Eaton, a nationally recognized telecommunications law firm. And Nick Miller is off fishing, I understand, these days.
That's exactly what he's doing.
Joe specializes in representing municipalities on a broad range of communications issues in federal and state courts, before federal and state agencies, and at the negotiating table. He's helped communities develop wireline and wireless communications ordinances, negotiated franchises, telecommunications services with cable and telecommunications service providers, and assisted communities in developing their own communication networks, and successfully defended local government efforts to establish and operate municipally owned systems. Mr. Van Eaton received his law degree cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania in 1979, and his undergraduate degree magna cum laude from Syracuse University in 1975. We had a couple of questions we wanted to ask you before we get started, just so that they kind of have a sense of the audience. How many of you are first-time attendees? Okay. There you go, guys.
We're all changing our
Yeah, right.
presentations.
This is important.
How many of you are in franchise negotiation or will be soon? Okay. Was that all? Those were the two big questions.
Some good, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, with that, we're going to start, as I said, with Brian, and we've broken it down. Here we go. My phone just went off. Brian is going to be talking about the current state of the cable and the MVPD, and for those of you who are new, that's multi-channel video programming distributor. MVPD, market, given the proliferation of over-the-top and other streaming services. And it seems like there's a new announcement every day. Dan is going to be talking about the cable franchising law as it stands today, because regardless of the changes that we see happening around us, there's really been no immediate change or very little immediate change in the cable franchising law. So that's, for most of us, that's what we have to deal with, and that's what we have to live with, for better or for worse. And then Joe will talk about the regulatory risks to local franchising and rights-of-way authority, both at the FCC and at Congress. And as I said, our goal is to leave plenty of time at the end for some Q&A and comments. With that, I'm going to invite Brian to come forward.
All right. Just before I stand up, I think it's worth noting that Cor and I honored the commitment of the group here to not wear ties today. These two guys trying to show us up. I was like, don't do that to Cor. She's not going to want to wear a tie. They did it anyway, so right there, you know the quality of speakers you have. I was trying to come up as I was sitting here thinking, what kind of an analogy could I use to the slow trickle down of cable subscribers that we're seeing? You know, every quarter we look at it and we lose a few more subscribers. And I was racking my brain to think of what could actually be a fair parallel. And what I came up with was my hair loss. So 10 years ago, I was 6'3" when you added up my hair. I was that much taller. I had a full head well, it still was gray, but it was at least a full head of hair. It was as thick as Jerry's in the back of the room. What's happened is each year I've lost a little bit more hair. And my barber keeps telling me at some point this could just stop and you might just stay right here with this amount of hair for the rest of your life. Or you could just keep losing a little bit more hair each year until you eventually don't have any hair and you got to go full Michael Jordan and just, live with it. And so that's where we find ourselves, is we have a trickle down of cable subscribers. We don't know when it's going to stop. It could stop and it could still be beautiful, just like this head of hair. There's enough here to deal with. Or I could end up coming back and, I could go Vin Diesel and just be completely bald next year. And we could find that as well with the cable subscriber counts. So with that lovely analogy, I'm going to start my presentation. I was charged with trying to set the table here in terms of the financial impact for everybody on your franchise fees, your PEG fees. Where do we sit? Most of this is going to be fairly intuitive for you, at least in my presentation. The hope is that it'll set the stage for Dan and for Joe as we go through and try to figure out where the future is. So, common questions that we came up with as we were prepping for this session: will all viewing shift to over the top? And I apologize if I keep looking this way. We don't have a monitor here today, so I'm kind of looking at it with you. Will all the viewing shift to over the top? I have 4 daughters. They are all college or beyond. 3 of those 4 have all shifted over the top. They would never pay for cable TV. They would use Dad's passcode. So if we have any Comcast representatives out here, please don't check my account and find out that my daughters are streaming it somewhere else. One daughter, who lives in Chicago, is now out working. She lives with 2 other roommates. She actually now has decided to pool her resources with her roommates, and she, for the first time in her life, is buying cable TV, because it ended up being, the way they packaged it was so much cheaper than to just buy the broadband alone. So she actually is the first millennial in my family to actually pay for cable TV. Will that trend occur, throughout the millennials? Will it occur throughout the over-the-top folks? Time will tell. I'm going to go through some statistics that will hopefully clarify that. But the question that you all have as you're going into your franchise renewal negotiations are we going to have any traditional cable subscribers left? How do we budget for this? What impact will that have on PEG financing? We'll be able to continue to afford to do PEG funding. Will we think of cable operators like Charter and CenturyLink and AT&T and those folks that we have thought of as cable TV operators, will we think of them as that, or will we think of them as just as broadband companies? And then, of course, what ultimate impact on our budget? Cor mentioned the multi-channel video programming distributor label. It's the label that the FCC uses. It's what we refer to as all these folks. And I apologize, this slide is a little tardy. Charter and Time Warner Cable are, of course, combined now, so that's the trade name Spectrum. But at any rate, this gives you a sense of what we think of as the traditional MVPDs. They're the hardwired cable operators that are out there trying to get the cable subscribers, the folks that generally you guys are franchising. So have we lost cable subs? And the answer is undoubtedly we have lost cable subs. In the first quarter this year, and these statistics are right off of their SQ statements that you see at the SEC, we've lost 559,000 subscribers in the first quarter, about the same exact pace for quarter two. So we're already at over 1 million subscribers lost. When you consider that the entire multi-channel video programming universe in the United States, give or take a few million, is right around 100 million, right? That's how big the subscriber base is for all of these companies combined. When you start talking about losing 1 million or potentially 2 million subscribers in a given year, the math's pretty simple. 1 or 2% loss in terms of subscriber base. That's pretty easy for you to translate into your budget. But of course, it's not quite that easy. We lose subscribers. That doesn't mean we necessarily see the same dip in our franchise fee payments. Because as we know, the price of cable is going up. In some cases, the cable operators are using it to help finance expansions of their system. In other cases, they're using it to pay for the increased programming costs that they're incurring from the various providers, whether it's broadcasters or the sports programmers. But at any rate, it doesn't necessarily have a one-to-one impact. Let's look at just AT&T in the second quarter of 2017. They lost 351,000 satellite and UVerse subscribers. That's a massive number. Now, they came out, of course, this year with DirecTV Now, and that is really their new product that they are pushing. So they've had some tremendous sales increases. In the second quarter alone, they had over 150,000 new subscribers to DirecTV Now. But what does that do for you? It doesn't provide any PEG channels, right? If you're a DirecTV Now subscriber, you're not getting the local PEG. You're not paying a PEG fee. You're certainly not paying a franchise fee. So the impact for the cities is rather significant. A couple of other statistics. I thought it would be helpful to take a look at the big boys. Comcast 2017 results. First quarter, their revenue increased 5.8%. And here we're looking at revenue just on communications, not on theme parks and film production and the many different revenue streams that Comcast has. Their video subs really bucked the trend in the entire industry. In the first quarter, they gained video subscribers. That kind of runs contrary to what I just said a moment ago, which is that we're losing 500,000 subs every quarter. Comcast seemed to buck that trend rather effectively. Was it a matter of how they priced their packages, how they combined it with their other services? Quarter two, industry was looking, or the financial industry was looking to see how they would fare. Could they continue it? Quarter two in the cable industry is traditionally a terrible quarter for subscribership because it's the summer months. Everybody's disconnecting, people are going off to their vacations, etc. So they will disconnect and then they'll reconnect back in quarter three. So they always anticipate worse Q2 numbers. Even there though, Comcast lost 34,000 subscribers. They added another 175,000 HSI high-speed internet customers, and they still grew their revenue in the quarter, just their communications revenue. So as you're budgeting your franchise fees, you're still looking at increased franchise fee revenue no matter what your decrease in subscribers are, or at least generally there's a correlation there. However, if your PEG fee is set on a per subscriber number, 50 cents, $1, $2 per subscriber per month, as the subscriber count goes down, of course you're seeing your revenue decrease. And I suppose Dan will be talking about that aspect of your renewal negotiations. Do you draw your PEG funding from a percentage similar to what many state franchises require, 1% for PEG support in addition to the 5% franchise fee, or do you tie it to a per subscriber number, which at least historically has been fairly common throughout the industry? Turning to Charter's numbers, their first quarter number down 2%. Remember now, Charter was struggling, and still is, I think, with assimilating in all the Time Warner properties into their new Spectrum trade name that they're using for the Bright House, the Charter, and the Time Warner properties. They actually viewed this number in the second quarter of losing 90,000 cable subscribers as a positive. The analysts expected something closer to 150,000 loss, which is what they took Q2 of 2016. So I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you here. This is actually a positive trend line for Charter, showing that they're actually getting that ship straight, losing fewer subscribers, getting a little more sticky with their existing customer base. Their video revenues were flat for the year, which again surprised the financial analysts that look at this very closely. They had expected a decrease on that issue. So this slide is a little more detailed. It's probably hard to read. I do have handouts back there for anybody that wants a copy, and if you didn't get one, just shoot me an email. I'll get you a copy of this. This is from the FCC report on competition. Long time ago in the 96 Act, Congress required the FCC to do annual reports on competition. The problem with this report, which is the most recent information we have, is that it's based on 2015 data that's reported in 2016, and then the report is written in early 2017. So take this for what it's worth. It's antiquated, but it's the most complete data that the FCC has. What it shows is video revenue overall increased by $3 billion for multi-channel video programming distributors, those cable operators that we talked about at the beginning. So they are still increasing their video revenue. Again, a positive sign for your franchise fee budgeting, perhaps a telltale that you don't have to think of doom and gloom in terms of the franchise fee revenue coming in. But what's happening to this industry is going to ultimately trickle down to all of the franchising authorities. Their margins are shrinking at an alarming rate because the cost of programming is going up so quickly. The cost of Fox Sports 1, ESPN, not to mention ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox generally, those channels are pressing their rates so high, it's putting increased pressure on the cable company. So this bottom slide piece that talks about, I think I actually have a laser. Nope. There it is, right down here, margins. In 2013, the margin on video was 20%. So a cable company was making some pretty good profit off of delivering cable TV. It dropped 5% in 2014 to 15. In 2015, it was just over 10%. On that trend line, this becomes a complete loss leader. Video isn't making any money for the cable company. It's simply a sticky product to make it harder for you to disconnect from your broadband service and go to a competing provider. So that issue is ultimately going to play its way into your franchise negotiations when there isn't as much money being made on the delivery of video services. Obviously, we all know the over-the-top game that's being played here. This is just one of 100 different scenarios for how you can get the over-the-top into your TV set. The number of different programmers that are out there now is too many to list. We used to have a slide a few years ago that would show there were 15 or 20 of them. Now there's literally hundreds of different over-the-top programmers. But in Q2 2017, these are some of the players that are now seriously taking on over-the-top. Google launched YouTube TV, something we hadn't had when we were at this conference last year. Hulu Live TV. Look at the people behind this company. Disney, Fox, Comcast, Time Warner, not the Charter version, but the other version of Time Warner. DirecTV Now, I talked about earlier, an online service that now has just under 400,000 subscribers, having just launched in about the last 6 months. And Netflix is now at 52 million subscribers. So I'm giving you some conflicting data that I think our other speakers are going to try to help clarify, but there's no question there is a continuing move to this type of over-the-top programming. But the question becomes, does that necessarily mean that we're all disconnecting from cable TV? Right now, 64% of the United States households have an over-the-top provider. So all of you out here, I think this is probably a tech-heavy crowd here, you probably have 100%. Maybe we'll just do a show of hands. How many people have over-the-top in their house somewhere? Maybe the better question, how many people don't have any over-the-top at all? Maybe 1 or 2 people. Okay, so we all have it. Everybody subscribes to Netflix or one of these services. That's up significantly from 2014. But this is an interesting slide. While we have all of these folks that are buying pay TV, look at the high bar on the left here. Many of us are actually subscribing to both. You're viewing the Netflix and the Hulu and the other services as a complement to your traditional cable TV company. Over-the-top only subscription is still a relatively small number. What we don't want, of course, is for that number to increase and this number to decrease, because the financial impact on your cities would be rather significant. When you look at Charter Spectrum, I thought it was interesting. Tom Rutledge is their CEO, a very experienced cable mind executive, has been in the industry for years, used to run these systems out in New York. He said that they view companies like Netflix and these other services as complements to their service. So for those of you that can't read, at the time he said this, which was just in the last 9-12 months, 57% of our video customer base subscribes to Netflix. They're not substitutes. I don't think Netflix is a substitute for what we sell. It's more of an ancillary service. So just like Comcast, they're now burning it into their interface. When you go on Charter's system, you can watch Netflix just like you could HBO, Showtime, Cinemax. It becomes almost an added premium service. Will that be the trend line going forward for the over-the-top, where they become integrated into the programming lineup? Maybe you pay extra fees, maybe it comes in the same bill, or will it ultimately result in you disconnecting entirely? And that's, of course, the question we're all grappling with. So, final slide. What does this all mean for us? The marketplace certainly believes in these companies. If you look at the total return on their stock values, Charter in particular, you look at when they emerged from bankruptcy to where they are today, we all would have been wise to put $100 into that stock. It has performed tremendously. I think in the neighborhood of 250% return. Substantial growth. Now, whether the market believes that's because of their broadband capabilities in the future or because of their strength to retain their existing video subscriber base, I think that probably going to vary from analyst to analyst. But certainly the marketplace sees companies like Comcast, Charter, other multi-channel video programming distributors as strong players, players that are worthy of continuing to invest in. But we just don't know whether, like the hair on my head, we're going to continue to lose the subscribers. Remember the plain old telephone service? It started slow. Eventually now, I'm sure I could do another show of hands. How many actually have a landline phone in their house? Okay, so we still have maybe 30% of you that have it. But the vast majority of you are starting to disconnect. Your cell service is sufficient enough. Will that happen with cable TV? We don't know the answer to that. Again, I could still have this same hair next year. You don't know. I could come in a whole different looking guy. So the question then we're going to try to answer is, as you negotiate your franchise, how can you best protect yourself to preserve your franchise fee revenue, preserve your PEG fee support so that your facilities and studios can thrive? And I think that's what I'm going to turn over to my other speakers. Thanks very much.
How we doing, Ezra?
No.
No. Good morning. My name is Dan Cohen. It's a pleasure to be here and at the NATOA conference, and really I think NATOA has done already a wonderful job. I was at the pre-conference day yesterday. It was a really exciting day, and also it's a pleasure to be on the panel with two telecom municipal attorney stalwarts, Brian Grogan and Joe Van Eaton. And now we're up, and I want to thank Ezra in the back for loading the PowerPoint. My job this morning is to talk about what's left of local franchising, and if Brian is right that the amount of power you have is based on the amount of hair on my head, they definitely picked the wrong guy for this for this job. So let's forget about that and let's move straight into local franchising. Okay. As Brian very well pointed out, there is uncertainty in this field, absolutely. 10 to 15 years ago, cable companies were virtual monopolies in the video market. Today, obviously, the industry has changed dramatically, both with wired competitive operators telephone companies, some companies that we call overbuilders like RCN, satellite dish companies, of course, and as Brian explained very well, video streaming. That's the kind of major dramatic change over the last few years and has resulted in certainly in cord cutting and in the proliferation of those over-the-top of video streaming services. So there are questions clearly about the future classification of these services. I think Joe will probably get into that issue. There's been a lot of industry consolidation. When I say consolidation, bigger companies gobbling up smaller companies. So Charter's acquisition of Time Warner, Altice's acquisition of Cablevision, if you live in the New York area. In my neck of the woods, Atlantic Broadband has just announced that they're taking over MetroCast. So there's been a lot of consolidation, and what that has done is made these companies less responsive, in my judgment, and a little less, and certainly less local. Statewide franchising, we already did a show of hands there. For those of you that do have statewide franchising, your rights have been basically eviscerated. There's not much you can do, and I'm sorry about that. I'm going to focus more on those in the local franchising world. Yet within this climate of uncertainty, there are certain constants, right? There are certain things that we know for sure. In the states that still have local franchising, local governments still have control over the public rights of way. When it comes to cable services, federal law gives you that control. And those local governments have a fair amount of power when it comes to franchising cable operators, and who better to show that power than Sheriff Gary Cooper from High Noon. And when it comes to the cable operators, there are still about 60 million. It depends on how you define it. Those are kind of traditional cable operators. There still are certainly millions of cable subscribers in the United States. But as Brian pointed out, the cable companies have suffered significant losses, and that has made them more aggressive in negotiations and frankly has emboldened them when it comes to franchise negotiations. So how should local governments respond to this era of uncertainty? Well, you need to be prepared, and you need to be prepared for battle and to fight for your legal rights, frankly. How do you do that? Okay, the guiding principle of our law firm when it comes to cable franchise negotiations is that you're effectively the kind of the landlords of your public rights of way, right? Cable operators have wires and other equipment that they install in the rights of way. You are entitled under federal law to a fair return on their use of your property. That's really what it comes down to. I mean, there are a lot of complexities when it comes to FCC regulations, et cetera, but that's really what it comes down to. And the best way to assert your rights and to obtain benefits is through cable franchise renewal. So how do you do that? Well, the preparation is all, right? What you're supposed to do under the Federal Cable Act, Section 626, is review the cable operator's past performance and identify your future cable-related needs. What does past performance mean? Has the cable operator complied with all of its obligations under the current franchise agreement? What does that entail? Well, it could entail up to 3 separate inquiries, depending on how large your jurisdiction is, how many resources you have to devote to this. But 1, a technical audit. Does the current cable system comply with National Electric Code and National Electrical Safety Code requirements, as well as your franchise agreement? A cable compliance review, which could include things like customer service complaints. Are they non-compliance issues or not? Build-out requirements for those of you who are in more rural areas. Have they fulfilled their build-out obligations? Complying with PEG channel requirements. We could do a whole day on that issue. And complementary services. Have they provided you the free services that they're supposed to provide? I wanted to kind of spend a little bit more time on the third item, which is a franchise fee audit. And that is, as you ramp up to cable franchise renewal, I would strongly recommend that you do a franchise fee audit. It ensures that you're receiving all the franchise fees that you're entitled to. It determines whether there are underpayments, and if there are, obviously the best time to collect on those underpayments is a time when the cable operator is asking for a renewal of its franchise, and it brings accountability to that line item in your budget. I'm saying this rhetorically, but how many of you can say for sure that the franchise fees you receive is the amount that you're supposed to receive? There aren't many other line items in the budget that you could probably say that you really don't know for sure, and a franchise fee audit does bring accountability. So what does an audit look into? Well, it looks into several things, but just to summarize briefly, one is the cable operator paying on all revenue sources that it's required to pay on? Remember, you're allowed to assess up to 5% of the cable operator's gross revenues. Gross revenues today includes at least 27 separate revenue sources, and those include subscriber-based, meaning all the video tiers, equipment rental, late fees, etc., and non-subscriber revenues, revenues that aren't paid by the subscriber, him or herself. Advertising is a classic example. Every time the local car dealership advertises on the cable system, the cable operator gets a commission. You can take 5% of that commission. Has the cable operator allocated bundled services correctly? So some of those sources that I mentioned, like late fees, for example, would apply to cable, internet, and phone. Has the cable operator allocated those correctly? It should be based on the number of subscribers for each one of those services. And finally, has the cable operator included all residential addresses in your jurisdiction accurately? So that's called a homes passed list, right? So you would get a homes passed list from the cable company. Cable systems are not built along municipal boundaries, and cable operators make mistakes often when it comes to addresses, sometimes putting addresses in your jurisdiction in the neighboring jurisdiction, which means your neighboring municipality or county or whatever is getting the franchise fees that you should be getting. More likely than not, your cable operator is underpaying. Okay. What's the second half of this? And it's identifying your future. So we talked about past performance, identifying future cable-related needs. First of all, you got to plan, right? You have to internally discuss and decide what's important to you. What are your needs? And you're required under the Cable Act, you probably would do this anyway, to have a notice and comment. That can be done through a public hearing, or it can be done through a residential subscriber survey. That's your choice. But you need to hear from your citizens as well. What are some of the things to look at? And we're going to get into this in just a little bit more detail in a minute. What are your cable system technical needs, your PEG channel needs, financial support for the PEG channel, iNet needs. Now, for those of you that have iNets, that's a critical question. If you're looking for a new iNet from a cable company in this competitive environment, in my experience, and these guys could disagree if they want, but it's not going to happen. But if you have a current iNet, you certainly can enhance it through this process. And customer service needs. Okay, so the preparation is really important, and who better to provide a driving reason for that. Bear Bryant, the former football coach of the University of Alabama. I know that there's a representative from Alabama here at the conference because I met him yesterday. It's not the will to win that matters. Everybody has that. It's the will to prepare to win that matters, and that really applies to cable franchising. Okay, finally, last two slides here. What are the key points to negotiate? And we're taking, again, a pretty large subject and summarizing it. But one is increase franchise fees through a redefinition of gross revenues. I strongly believe that you should enumerate revenue sources in your franchise agreement and not have a general definition. That avoids confusion with the cable operator, so the cable operator knows exactly what to apply that franchise fee to, that percentage to. We also include a crystal ball item to capture any future sources that we can't even conceive of today. Greater franchise fee accountability, that's really the audit provisions, maybe a longer look-back period, penalties for underpayments, et cetera. Upgrade of the cable system. Look at, for some cable operators, traditional cable operators, they have not upgraded their system in a long time. So that can be an important issue going forward. And remember, that affects obviously your internet service as well as your cable service. PEG channel enhancements, the number one enhancement, of course, is high definition. There are people in this room that work on this issue every day. If you don't have high definition format, you need it. It really is important to the survival of your PEG channel. Other things like VOD, video on demand, electronic menu for actual programming instead of just saying government access, public access, educational access, that's critical. Financial support for your PEG channel. This is a tough one, and Brian certainly alluded to it as to, and maybe we can get into this more in the question and answer, how do you best structure financial support for your PEG channel? There are many different ways to do it, per subscriber, percentage of gross revenues. Based on what Brian said and what we've experienced, I think percentage of gross revenues, frankly, makes a little more sense. But the important thing is, with each new renewal, to increase that pot, not to decrease it. You got to have a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. On the free cable services front, just a shout out to my next speaker, Joe Van Eaton, had a really nice victory just a couple of months ago in the Sixth Circuit. It's called Montgomery County, Maryland versus FCC, where the Sixth Circuit said that in-kind services may not be offset against franchise fees. You may recall that a couple of years ago, the FCC said that they could. Some cable operators, most cable operators don't do it. Some cable operators either do or were attempting to do it. Joe, I think that decision really shuts that argument down, at least for the moment. On iNet expansion and enhancements, that decision also helped in that area where the Sixth Circuit said that you can indeed regulate iNets. Stronger, more enforceable customer service standards. Again, as consolidation has occurred, generally, and I'm not pointing fingers at any particular cable operator, generally customer service has decreased. You'd want to have strong and enforceable customer service standards in your agreement. And finally, legal protections of your rights of way. That includes everything from repair and restoration to public safety standards. And you got to have strong enforcement mechanisms. If you don't, if you can't enforce the agreement, it's not worth the paper that it's written on. And we strongly believe in liquidated damages or monetary fines. The cable operator violates the agreement, you give them notice, 30 days to cure, and if not, to apply daily monetary fines. So, is there uncertainty ahead? Absolutely. As Brian pointed out, in terms of the changes in technology and the number of customers related to cable television and the classification, absolutely there's uncertainty ahead. But I'm an optimist, and my view of it is one that was captured by Margaret Atwood, who said, "When nothing is sure, everything is possible." Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dan. You know, that last quote is really something I believe, that actually localities have enormous opportunities now with respect to cable franchising, but they also, particularly the folks in this room, need to look beyond traditional cable franchising and begin to think about what their responsibilities are to their community. So let me go back and tie together two things our previous speaker said. Brian's telling you how much the cable revenues have gone down. Let me just reemphasize the total Comcast per customer, they now have something called a customer relationship. Those revenues went up 2.2% over the last year. The business revenues went up 12.6%. That was a revenue stream Comcast didn't even have 10 years ago. The last time your franchise was negotiated, they didn't have relationships with businesses. They didn't even sell cable services to a lot of businesses. Now that's the fastest growing sector of revenues for their business, followed closely by internet services, which are up in revenues by about 10%. So what does that mean with respect to what Dan said about your right-of-way? It means your rights-of-way are actually more valuable today. And if you focus on what you'll be told to focus on in negotiations, which is, look at how bad things are for me, and you look at how good things are for them using your property, you might get a different perspective on what you should be shooting for and what you should be trying to achieve. But it also means you need to make sure that in your cable franchise, you don't do something that actually ends up creating problems or removing future opportunities for growth and for relationships. Now I'm going to talk about some of the risk and opportunities that you have in terms of controlling your public assets. Because I think this will determine whether in the future you get public benefits commensurate with the value you're delivering to these private enterprises or not. And let me tell you that I'd like to add to Dan's point, I think what's becoming critical when you're negotiating a franchise are what's the scope of the franchise, right? Is it going to allow them to put wireless facilities in the rights of way? Because I guarantee you, Altice, the successor to Cablevision, takes the point of view that if you give them a cable franchise, they also get to put wireless facilities in your rights of way without paying you anything more for that, okay? What's the definition of gross revenues? Does it cover, and by that I mean, do you give them the authority to do anything they want in the right of way if they only pay a cable service fee? Or do you reserve the right to come back and impose additional fees if they provide, and for additional lines of business, up to the extent you can do under your law? Most favored nations clause is something every cable operator is insisting upon right now, okay? For those, are you giving them something that will allow them to get out of franchises or out of payments if someone's offering over-the-top services? And if you talk to Ken Feldman, who's dealing with this issue in Colorado, the relationship between a company called Level 3 TV, and which offers something that they say on their website is a cable service, but that's delivered via traditional cable lines. That argument is actually being raised. The cable operators are coming in and saying, well, wait a minute, if you don't get a franchise fee from those folks, we shouldn't have to pay that either. We should get relief from PEG and all these other things. So those most favored nations clauses become really critical when you're negotiating. PEG requirements. As the world is changing, we know, for example, that every cable operator offers an internet plus video package right now, right? That they actually sell under their internet side of the, if you went to the web page and said, I want internet, they'll give you an add-on for a video service that the operators classify as a cable service. That's not part of basic service. Are your PEG channels being carried on that streaming service or not? A lot of us got into the habit of writing, PEG channels get carried on basic service. Well, basic service is carried on a linear basis on a cable television channel, and that's not the way operators are actually delivering video services to their subscribers anymore. So you need to rethink all these things in light of the developments in technology. But it doesn't mean you can't do it. It means you have to think harder about it and think about how you're going to protect your interests. So let me talk about some of the risk I see. The streaming services, as we talked about, present a risk to franchise fees and PEG. Why? Because if there's no fee on the provision of streaming services, then, and essentially you view the world as a closed box where there's a certain amount of money folks pay and a percentage goes to things that are not subject to the franchise fee and are not subject to the PEG fee, your revenues are ultimately going to drop whether they're on a per sub basis or not. Right? You're going to have fewer subscribers to the services. Now, the interesting thing is, when operators come in and tell you, when you're having a lot of streaming services, and you need to start thinking from your standpoint, should those folks be getting either cable franchises or are they subject to fees under applicable law? And it's not obvious at all that streaming services are exempt. I think a company that just delivers via the public internet has a pretty good argument they're exempt from these things. They're no different than a telephone call being made by lawyers to their clients. No one would think that is subject to sort of a franchise fee because we're doing business over the communications line. But if you look at a company that's delivering specialized services that are streaming in the sense that they're IP-based, Comcast does it, they should be paying a franchise fee on it. It's going over their cable system. It's not delivered over the public internet. Anything that's not delivered over the public internet, and there's a lot of streaming services like that, should be subject to a fee. And in fact, if you look at California, we actually have a decision that just recently came out within the last 3 weeks that suggested that localities do have authority under that state law, and this would be true under every state, I think, that adopted statewide franchising, to reach revenues that aren't reached under traditional cable franchising. I'll talk a little bit about that decision. So, and the only other thing is some services are real-time, some aren't real-time. There's going to be a big argument as to whether streaming services that are real-time are the same as streaming services that are not real-time. The ones that are real-time are more like traditional cable services. The on-demand services were actually always exempt from the definition of what video programming was. A company that simply offered on-demand services was never subject to cable franchising under the original 1984 Cable Act. So this is all going to make a significant change, and if you think about it, what this means, you can think about it in the scope of my franchise. I want to make sure that if I don't reach these services under my cable franchise, I reserve the right to come back and reach them under different authority in terms of my control over the rights of way. Okay, and this is very important because of a case involving the city of Eugene we'll talk about. Treatment of mixed-use systems. This was, the question was, do you get to, as these systems become gigantic mixed-use systems, and I as a customer am trying to call the company, what happens to local authority? One of the things that's frustrating to me is I as a customer call and make a choice whether I'm going to go to item 1, the telephone service, item 2, the cable service, or item 3, the internet service, but in fact, my service is out. All 3 services are usually out when I have a service problem. So I still need good telephone answering whether I press the button for internet service or not. All those issues become difficult to manage and measure and enforce when you're dealing with mixed-use systems, because from the customer's perspective, they're just interested in service. Right? So the interesting thing is, does the fact that they're offering mixed-use systems give operators opportunities to either put abusive requirements in their customer service contracts that prevent customers from enforcing rights, or do they allow them to escape customer service obligations? And that becomes more and more important as the system becomes less transparent from your standpoint, right? You don't know who's calling about what the problems are. You're just getting complaints, and that becomes that becomes a real challenge in dealing with cable franchising. Control over government assets. We've talked about the right-of-way. But the interesting question is, you've also got other property that's becoming more and more valuable to traditional cable operators and other video service providers. That includes your light standards, utility poles, and other structures that you're now getting requests from wireless providers to use. Now, why is that important? Because one of the things we know folks are looking at is essentially eliminating the drop to the home, right? If everyone could get rid of the drop to the home, which is expensive to install, expensive to maintain, and which is easily damaged by the homeowner. And you could instead put a wireless device up and stream the same programming to a simple device in the home. That's probably the way you'd go. And that's one of the reasons why Google is moving away from considering a fiber to the home model to a different model where they're using unlicensed frequency, and essentially they'll get to outside the home and deliver the video into the home wirelessly. That means you've now got a new set of assets that are valuable to those providers, and it also means you've now got something that's not quite a cable system in the way we've traditionally thought about it, but that is using your rights of way. And if you want to protect your franchising rights, you're going to need to assert rights over those types of systems as we move forward, okay? Whether that comes under your Title VI authority, it might be a cable system, or whether it comes under some other authority, that's something you're going to have to look at, and it's obviously something you don't want to give away when you're going through the franchise negotiations. And it also becomes important to make sure that you don't mix up the right-of-way, which you want to charge for through a franchise fee, with rents for use of your other government property. Every piece of property you own that's proprietary, you want to rent and lease and get a price for that, much like if you own an electric utility. The electric utility would never say, oh, you have a franchise, now you don't have to pay a pole attachment fee. No, the electric utility is going to charge a pole attachment fee plus the franchise fee. So you're going to need to think about how you weave the use of your assets into your cable franchises. Treatment of wireless services, I've sort of discussed a little bit. I want to talk a second and then throw it open for questions about where the issues are playing out. They're playing out in state legislatures, and what we're seeing now is a model where a lot of very bad legislation is pushing through the states in a way that would deprive localities of control, not just of their rights of way, but of a lot of their assets. It's going to become important to you, not just from small cell placement issues, to address those, but to also think about them as more broadly affecting your right to control future technologies and future communication systems that begin to develop in your community. In the state courts, we're now going to see that play out. Does that legislation pass muster under state constitutions, a lot of which prohibit gifts to private enterprises? And so we're starting to see folks challenge legislation that essentially requires localities to subsidize non-public utilities through essentially a gift of public property. There's actually been some good news, by the way, these slides will be on BBK on our BBK website, www.bbklaw.com, including a version where I left this version. Apparently, I left out an important site. But this first case is one I mentioned before. This involves the city of Eugene, and kudos to the city of Eugene for fighting this battle for a long time, and the other Oregon communities for fighting this. The Comcast came in and said, you know, when you gave us your cable franchise, you can't charge a fee on internet service. The franchise fee covers our entire use of the rights of way, under the Cable Act. And the Oregon Supreme Court said, no, that's not the case. In Oregon, you have the authority to charge people for use of the rights of way. This is a different use of the rights of way. You get to charge them not just on cable service, but you can use your independent franchising authority, not over cable systems, not under the Cable Act, but your independent authority to impose a fee for use of the rights of way that falls on internet services. So now, if I'm an Oregon community, that's pretty good news, right? All the problems Brian's talking about begin to go away if you can actually reach additional streams of revenues, and the cable company essentially has to pay on whatever streams of revenues are developing across its system. So it's going to be important for you to think that's good news, and now it becomes important for everybody to go back and look at their own state laws and say, how does that work out? So in the federal courts, as Dan said, we won a very big victory in Montgomery County v. FCC, that essentially addresses a lot of arguments cable operators are using to minimize what they have to commit to in franchise negotiations. In-kind cable-related services are not franchise fees. What does that protect? Free services to schools and public buildings is one of the primary things. So it actually allows you to deliver a benefit to important constituencies in your community through your franchise. An INET may be required, and we are getting some, not necessarily new INETs, but we are getting additional money to expand existing INETs. And that was something that was in danger because the operators were taking the position that any money for an INET counted against the franchise fee. And localities may regulate non-cable, non-common carrier aspects of the system. What does that mean when I talk about customer services? It means your customer service rules don't necessarily have to be restricted to cable services. Okay? So you may have broader authority to protect your consumers, which is politically important, I think, in terms of protecting the value that your office brings to the community. And it will be very important if this FCC reclassifies internet as a non-common carrier service. If they reverse the net neutrality rules, then essentially internet service will become a non-common carrier service and a non-cable service, and potentially you'll be able to address issues related to internet use in your cable franchise, which may lead to more system upgrade requirements because that's a big problem, and may lead to your ability to address underserved areas more effectively.
Joe, before you go on, can you speak to what the industry is saying on this case, which is, again, industry's words, this is nothing more than a remand. We like our chances in this FCC to reinstitute exactly what you fought to undo. And it's a tremendous victory, but play it forward. What do you see over the next 2 years coming out of this decision?
Well, I actually am seeing different things. The industry has gone to, this case was not, when you win a court case against the FCC, the court sends it back to the FCC and says, can you do it right? Not meaning you'll win if you do it again, but you got to do it again. You got to explain it better than you did before.
And it'll take 7 years to do it.
It'll take and that's right. And this case took over 10 years from start to finish, and we've been waiting for the decision since the order was issued in 2007. And the court actually went out of its way to say, if it comes back to you, please don't take as long to get to the point. So the industry is coming in actually saying, let's move forward. But we're not hearing from the FCC that there's a lot of reason to move forward with this, at least as an individualized rulemaking. Why? Well, the in-kind cable issue, in some ways, it's not that expensive to the cable operators. I'm not quite sure. I think we got hit by it in 2007. I think it hurts us. I don't think it hurts cable operators. I don't think there's a huge idea that having those requirements prevents competition from developing. iNets, the FCC conceded we can do iNets under the law, so that's not something that's going to be revisited, I think, as part of this deal. And the last is the mixed-use system. And right now, as the court correctly pointed out, we can't regulate telecom communications or common carrier services under our cable franchising authority. So that leaves a narrow range of services that are right now non-common carrier services. So I think the urgency for dealing with this is not great now. It would become great if net neutrality is reversed, because then it would be a larger universe. And one of the issues that the FCC is considering is whether it should limit local authority to charge additional fees to cable operators in addition to the franchise fee. And they're considering that as part of an ongoing rulemaking that's looking at wireline and wireless deployment.
So the key, though, to that is don't allow the cable operator to burn in 621 order provisions on the assumption that those will ultimately be upheld by the FCC in a new rulemaking, which is what the form documents that you get actually are.
Can everybody hear Brian? Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
So
can you just repeat that?
No, I actually couldn't repeat it. I was listening.
So what some cable operators are doing are saying, we want you to adopt in your new franchises provisions that burn in our interpretation of the law. So it doesn't really matter what the courts or the FCC says. You've now entered into a contract where you agree we can offset in-kind services, or you agree you are limited to simply the FCC's customer service regs. So then it takes all of this that Joe's won on behalf of cities and renders it moot. Just be careful about those kind of provisions where you are basically stating the law the way the operator would like to see it interpreted instead of the way it actually may play out in the courts or at the FCC.
Okay. So let me go over one more decision here. This is Comcast's Sacramento decision. It just came out about 3 weeks ago. Essentially in California, and this is true in a lot of the state franchising states, the CPUC, or the state regulatory body, collects a fee from the cable operator to defray their cost. And cable operators in California were deducting the amount of the payment to the state from the franchise fee, essentially saying that's the same as a franchise fee. The Sacramento challenged that and won in court, and the court said, no, the payment you make to the state is more like a utility fee, the same sort of thing other utilities are paying. And Comcast said, no, wait a minute. A franchise fee is any fee imposed upon a cable operator because of their status as such, and this is imposed upon us as cable operators. The court came back and said, no, under the state franchising legislation, it reaches not just cable operators, but video service providers as defined under state law. And that's true in every state franchise, right? There's something called a cable operator, and there's something called a video service provider. It was written for AT&T. And the court said the video service provider could include things like Netflix. It could include any number of streaming services beyond a cable operator that aren't cable operators. So they all may be subject to these fees. Well, that's kind of an interesting development because I'm not sure the court was right about whether Netflix would be for reasons we discussed in streaming, but there are a lot of services, including some of the new streaming services that will be leasing capacity from cable systems, that I think would easily fall within the definition in California law. So with that, let me turn it over. The other issues are at the FCC. As I mentioned, this will be on our website, www.bbklaw.com. All I can tell you is all these there's a lot of proceedings active that deal with all the issues we've been talking about. And it's really important for your community to be involved directly at the FCC through ex partes and through participation in these proceedings, because that's how the other way you're going to protect your interests, aside from at the negotiating table. Thank you.
We now have 15 minutes for Q&A, so who wants to start? Garth. And I think they want you to come up to the microphone here.
You don't think I can yell about that?
They're probably...
Two things. One, Dan, you'd made mention that on the bundled services and late fees need to be allocated. I'm sorry to disagree with you, buddy, but late fees don't need to be allocated. Typically, they're defined as a separate item in the franchise agreement, and it's not an allocated item. Second, you guys did not address one of the growing revenue streams of cable providers is backhaul from these cellular companies, and I was just curious how you think that should be treated.
Well, I'll start. Sometimes the simplest definitions can be the most effective. Right now, I think a very effective definition for gross revenues is any and all revenue derived from the provision of cable services by the cable operator in the city, period. If that were your only definition and you had no laundry list of inclusions or exclusions, you then open the door for somebody like Garth, who's an expert in looking at these. I think you've maximized what the federal law permits you to collect on, and you've left open then the question of, is it or is it not a cable service? If it's not, if it's deemed to be a broadband service or something else, you fight that battle under the the Title VI Cable Act. Where you get into trouble sometimes is with too wordy of a definition, where it starts to tie the hands of your outside financial advisors who look through, and as new sources of revenue come about, they then are, again, kneecapped a little bit because the definition may preclude the city from going after that. So I'll start with that. I'm sure the other folks have more comments.
Thank you. Ambiguity, I think, works in favor of the cable operator. So I agree that being more specific, I think, helps, as long as you have, as I mentioned before, what we call a crystal ball item that says, every other cable service revenue. But if you have a kind of generalized definition that doesn't enumerate revenue sources, including everything that could be a cable service, then you run the risk of the cable operator having control over that definition, right? So even if you don't do a franchise fee audit every year, every couple of years, and you want to just monitor what the cable operator is doing, it's easier to do it when you have an enumerated definition, and in my judgment, lessens challenges down the road.
So my feeling, I think your question illustrates one of the issues, or one of the challenges to negotiators and to telecommunications officers and advisors, which is the way I normally think of backhaul, it would not be a cable service. It would be a telecommunications service that's probably provided not even by Comcast, the cable company, but by Comcast subsidiary that leases capacity from Comcast, the cable company, and provides and holds a certificate of public convenience and necessity from the state PUC, or Public Utilities Commission. And I think that's where you want to make sure that you preserve your right to charge additional fees, either through utility taxes, to the extent you can do that, or through additional franchise type requirements or privilege taxes for use of the public rights of way. Sometimes that's limited by state laws to what you can do, but in other places, Oregon being an example, it's actually a viable option. So I don't think it has to be a cable service for a locality to collect revenues. I think localities need to look at what the source of the authority is. The problem it illustrates is when you use the word backhaul, I don't actually know what you mean exactly. What is that service involved? What's being backhauled, right? In a lot of cases, what I'm finding is it's somehow difficult to sort of break things apart and understand whether they're cable services or not without seeing the underlying contracts. Right? A good example is the Layer 3 model where they're marketing something called cable service, but claim they're not subject to cable franchises, even though we know they have leases for use of capacity that we'd normally think would make them a cable system. Yeah. So, but we haven't seen those yet. So until we do, we don't know. It's hard to sort of say with certainty what the status is.
Mike Wassner, ACM. Thanks for doing this, guys. Really appreciate this. I'm curious about your perspective about making sure that PEG channels have a competitive, on a competitive even basis with commercial channels on many different systems. Because what I think we see typically in terms of negotiations is sort of a systematic way of making sure that the channels are not competitive. They can't be seen on the most seen tiers. They're not. While we may have been battling for basic cable distribution, that may not be where most eyeballs are in terms of HD tiers at this point. In another way, the way in which people watch through DVR and non-live viewing, the entire idea of having the ability to have sort of a quality of use of PEG channels seems to be, it doesn't exist on most systems, particularly because of the way the interactive guides are not engineered specifically for local program content. And you're dealing with national, and in some cases transnational products, and companies that are interested in transnational marketing of entertainment, and they're not so much interested in localism. So I'm curious about this concept of sort of equal treatment of the channels within sort of your negotiations at the, within the local franchising systems. When the cable industry pushes back against HD, the standard line is, oh, well, that'll come up in the next cable negotiation. Right. And for the 20 plus states that have no local franchising, they're stuck in 1980s technology in many instances. So I'm just kind of curious about how we push forward this concept of equal competitive positioning for PEG channels within that changing market.
Well, first of all, I think PEG is driven by each individual city. I have had clients that don't find it to be the end-all be-all, and they want to put their powder in a different issue. There are plenty of other cities that it becomes a crucially important issue. So, as we sit up here, first of all, we look to the client, I believe, to first tell us what your priorities are, what your issues are, and of course inform you of what your options are. You can do a whole presentation, hours, on just the PEG issues. They're the most complicated to negotiate in any franchise renewal because they're so specific to the community. HD is just one aspect of it. You mentioned the electronic programming guide. Even where operators are willing to allow that relationship to occur, sometimes it's not technically feasible. Sometimes PEG channels are shared in a given metropolitan area over many cities. So the city that Joe lives in has one lineup, I have a different lineup. It's all off of a same channel that's narrowcast. Which one is the EPG going to tie to? Those issues have technical implications on top of your relationship with the EPG. I guess what I would say in the end is most cities that are sophisticated on PEG usually have the benefit of advisors and consultants on the technical side to come in and lay out the key objectives and the needs of the community. Those are what folks that negotiate then drive off of and try to achieve. And it varies also by operator. Some operators are more accommodating to PEG, and others do seem to be driving towards rendering them less and less relevant in the marketplace. And again, that's going to vary by negotiation and by community.
Let me just jump in real quick. I agree with, remember how we talked about your preparation and making sure that you do planning internally before even going out on the battlefield with the cable operator. If you have a PEG channel, and if you believe in preserving that PEG channel and enhancing it, then one, you've got to do a residential survey and be able to demonstrate that people are watching that channel, right? Have a PEG needs assessment, so that you go into that battle, and I'm sorry I keep using this imagery, but with well armed, right? You need to. And if you're well armed, then I think you can, it's not easy, but you can get some of the things to make that PEG channel more competitive. HD, I think, is absolutely number one. But beyond that, as Brian said, the electronic programming, video on demand platform, I think, is critical. In the agreement, there are also other things that you can do, things like saying that the PEG channel has to be technologically equivalent to commercial channels, and obviously making sure that the channels are received or able to be received by all cable subscribers. So there are a lot of things you can do. If you have a priority to have local programming in your community, especially if you have a history of a richly programmed PEG channel, you can enhance it, but you got to go in well prepared.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I'd say, Mike, answering your question more broadly, I think it's really important not to get stuck in today's technology. I was the only one that was not introduced as a young person. You guys know about. So I actually remember cable franchises that required black and white TV channels, and these were channels that in the 1980s only had to carry black and white because somebody thought in 1975 a black and white TV channel was fabulous.
Okay, now you win on the not.
But I think it becomes important to think about yardsticks and ways you can think about, okay, how would I describe the delivery I want? If your objective is delivery to everybody who's getting video services, then you don't write it's going to be delivered as part of this tier, because that tier may not exist in a year. If you're worried about quality, you don't say HD, because HD is a meaningless term. It's not a standard. It's HD could be anything that is above standard definition quality. And so ultra high definition is a type of HD. So if you've got a 10 or 15 year franchise, you've got to think about what quality standard, what is my goal? Is it to keep up with what? And you mentioned commercial channels. I would say maybe a little closer on that if you want the local network affiliates, because some commercial channels are terrible on the cable system. You've probably noticed that. Right. So those are the sort of things you need to think about to come up with a quality standard. And I want to emphasize the guide becomes really important. People write guide in. I'm now a Comcast subscriber, and I started using X1. How many here have used X1? So I don't know if you're like me, but once I started using X1, I don't use the guide anymore because it's a voice-activated system where I put in something and it pops up and I don't have to scroll through.
Doesn't it just default to Grateful Dead for you?
Yeah, it does.
All
does.
24 hours.
Yeah, 24-hour Grateful Dead channel. I'm so glad Comcast carries that.
Well, let's keep a dose of reality too, though, that all of these things we're saying, there is somebody on the other side of the table. And so all of these are aspirational. This is what you strive for. The reality is you're trying to get a deal done without going potentially to a formal fight in federal court. So sometimes there has to be some trade because, for example, some of the things Joe said, ideal, but the operator may say, I can't get there. And so you may end up trading some of those things off in negotiations, or if you want to fall on your sword on that, be prepared. You've got to go to the mat then, because some of those deviate from the punch list that your negotiator will be able to actually agree to.
Yeah.
And getting a deal done is going to be motivated by your elected officials, and in many cases bosses of yours that are not in this room. So we understand the reality that you're all facing on that.
And by the way, I think that dealing with this quality is going to become more important for you because the FCC is about to issue a potential, I think it's a notice, Jerry actually will correct me after I say this, where they're effectively going to get rid of the technical standards for cable channels.
Yeah.
Okay, those are going to become, it's going to become basically a responsibility of the local government to enforce technical quality standards, which makes
And only if you had it in your franchise, which was negotiated before they told you you were going to be responsible.
Yeah.
Just because we're running out of time, Jerry's been very patient, so I'm going to let you
Thank you.
go ahead, and then we'll try and be concise in our responses.
I was, I guess it would be interesting to do a show of hands. How many people are from state franchise states that are in the room? Yeah, that's interesting because, I mean, the title of the program is, Swimming Upstream, and I kind of feel like Dory telling the folks in states, keep swimming, keep swimming. But Joe, when he talked about the 621 case, there's a fourth bullet, and that is that it doesn't apply to state franchise states, and that's important because TechFUI, Texas Coalition of Cities for Utility Issues, did fund part of the appeal. But I was hoping the three of you might talk about the different role, or perhaps the expansive capture of the state franchise laws, because it isn't just a cable operator, but it's a video service provider, and that definition is much more expansive, or captures a whole lot more. And I was just wondering, between the 621 order and some of these new over-the-top folks that might qualify as VSPs, I mean, is it time for the state folks to get back in the game? And is that an opportunity? Should they jump back in the pool, the water's fine, and start swimming? I don't know. I just sort of
We
thought
usually
about
throw
this.
that question to you.
Well,
I'm by no means the lobbyist that Jerry is, but I recall listening to, I think it was Jerry, give the speech, which is be careful opening back up a state legislature to reassess your legislation, because they usually look at that as just an opportunity to say, how can we potentially help the industry be more competitive? And I understand the rationale for it, but if the cities are not very well prepared, very well positioned to pursue their objectives, sometimes you open that box, you can't close it down again. So it's
Yeah.
probably going to vary.
And I don't see them opening the box until they have a reason to do so. But I guess I'm just wondering, I mean, Joe was talking about the California case, and are there opportunities? I mean, look, let me really put all my cards on the table. How do we get the Atlantas of the world back in NATOA? Is there a message that we can send to them? And just a thought.
Well, Jerry, I think it depends on the state legislation, but I would say that one of the things we've been learning through work in California around the small cell legislation is the importance of localities going to the state legislatures years in advance of the date they need the legislation, right? Because legislation passes not because somebody gets a bright idea, puts it in a public bill, and then debates it. The debate occurs before the bill is ever introduced, and you win or lose significant leverage if you're reacting rather than proacting. So I hope you can take some of the messages we've been getting here, share it with others, and say, look, maybe it is now time. You don't have to propose legislation. You just have to propose principles and sell people on principles that have to be protected. I was struck, I'm doing some research in Mississippi. In 1926, Mississippi, which I think most people in this room would say, that wasn't the most advanced state in terms of property rights of localities, was it? Was it? Well, it turns out it was. Why? Because years ago they recognized that if they starve localities from money, they wouldn't be able to build infrastructure like roadways, street lights, or anything else. So they imposed a state law that guaranteed a fee that reached revenues from all types of providers at that time. Pretty significant, right? The same thing has to be going on now as you begin to work with your innovation officers and say, I need money for the IoT. Autonomous vehicles are going to require me to redo all my street signs, right? These folks who are using my rights of way, if we don't get a fair share from them, we're essentially going to be asking the taxpayers to pay for something that really it's going to be very difficult to support an advanced infrastructure unless you start charging folks for use of the rights of way who are profiting the most from our rights of way.
A couple things real quick. Great question, Jerry. I think a lot of people that are in statewide franchising states have just kind of thrown up their hands. And I did use the term eviscerated before in terms of your local rights if you're in a statewide franchising state. I think in some, and Joe is right. I mean, state by state, there are some nuggets in some statewide franchising laws that I think that you can use, right? Even audit provisions where, whether it's the Attorney General or it's the locality, in some statewide franchising states can can do that, and I recommend that you take advantage of that. To me, the real lesson from statewide franchising is, let's not let it happen in the wireless arena. And I know that's not what this session is about, but that's exactly what's happening right now in the wireless arena. We were not prepared, right? And I say that because I have the scars of battle from Pennsylvania. And I'm happy to say in Pennsylvania, we still have local franchising because municipalities rose up and they contacted their state legislators and the bill died. I'm not saying it's going to be quite as easy as this time around. Brian and I discussed this beforehand. But we need to rise up and we need to do a better job this time around with state wireless bills that, even though they're completely different bills, they have the same result, which is to take away your authority over the public rights of way. And let's use the statewide franchising experience as a lesson to not let it happen again.
Thank you very much. Let's thank our panelists. And I believe we have a break now, but if you have any questions, they'll hang around for a little bit, or you can follow them into the...
Thanks.
thanks.
Great. Are you heading back?
Tomorrow. No, not tomorrow. Thursday.